The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud, and through it came a figure that would change everything at Silverbrook Ranch. She moved with the careful gait of someone who had learned that each step might bring pain, her left leg dragging slightly as she navigated the rocky path that led down from the mountain pass. In her arms, she cradled a wicker basket lined with faded blue cloth, and from within came the softest of sounds, tiny squeaks and rustlings that spoke of fragile life clinging to hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Whitmore had been walking for 4 days, though time had become a blur of putting one foot in front of the other, of searching for shelter when the mountain nights grew too cold, of rationing the last of her bread while making sure the baby rabbits in her basket had enough of the tender grass she gathered along the way. Her dress, once a respectable gray wool, now bore the stains of travel and desperation. The hem was torn from catching on thorns, and her boots, good leather that had been her one extravagance before her world collapsed, now showed cracks that let in stones and morning dew. But it was the locket that truly told her story. It hung heavy against her chest, a gold oval that caught what little sunlight filtered through the mist. She touched it unconsciously as she walked, the way others might worry a rosary or clutch a cross. Inside that locket lay everything she had left of her former life, everything that mattered, everything that terrified her. She hadn't opened it in 3 weeks, not since the night she fled from the boarding house where Mrs. Henderson had made it clear that a woman with no money and no husband had very few options for survival, and none of them respectable. The rabbits had been an accident, or perhaps providence. She had discovered them 2 days into her journey, their mother dead beside the trail, likely taken by a coyote or mountain cat. 7 tiny creatures, eyes barely open, mewing with hunger and cold. Any sensible person would have left them to nature's harsh judgment. Clara had scooped them into her empty food basket and spent precious time gathering milk from wild goats to keep them alive. She told herself it was practical. Rabbits meant food, eventually, or trade. But in the quiet moments between walking and sleeping, she knew the truth. These helpless things needed her, and she needed to be needed by something, anything, that wouldn't betray her trust. Now, as Silverbrook Ranch spread out below her in the valley, Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with approaching strangers. The ranch was larger than she had expected, with a main house that spoke of prosperity without ostentation, barns and outbuildings arranged with the careful planning of people who understood both work and weather. Cattle dotted the pastures, and she could see figures moving between the buildings, men beginning their daily tasks as the sun finally burned through the mountain mist. She paused at the edge of the property, suddenly conscious of her appearance. Her reflection in a stream that morning had shown her a woman she barely recognized, hollow-cheeked, with shadows under green eyes that had once been bright with laughter. Her auburn hair, once her pride, hung in a simple braid that had come half undone during her descent from the mountain pass. The bruises from her last encounter with Mrs. Henderson's solution to her problems had faded to yellow-green smudges along her jaw, but she knew they were still visible to anyone who looked closely enough. The baby rabbits stirred in their basket, and one, the smallest, with fur like spun gold, poked its tiny head above the cloth. Clara smiled despite everything, gently stroking the creature with one finger. These 7 had become her purpose, her responsibility, her excuse to keep moving when everything in her wanted to simply lie down beside the trail and let the mountain take her. She straightened her shoulders and began walking toward the main house, practicing words in her mind. "Good morning, sir. I'm looking for work. I can cook and clean and mend. I have references." The lies came easier now than they had 3 weeks ago. She had no references except for Mrs. Henderson, and that woman would only speak poison about Clara's character and circumstances. But desperation had taught her that sometimes survival required bending the truth until it nearly broke. The ranch yard was busy with morning activity, and Clara felt the weight of curious glances as she approached. Cowboys paused in their tasks to watch her progress, not unkindly but with the cautious interest of men who rarely saw strangers, especially women traveling alone. She kept her eyes fixed on the main house, where smoke rose from the chimney and lamplight glowed yellow in the windows despite the growing daylight. Before she could reach the porch, a voice called out behind her. "You lost, miss?" Clara turned to see a man emerging from the largest barn, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, probably 6 feet and more, with the easy movement of someone comfortable in his own skin. His hair was dark brown with threads of premature silver at the temples, and his eyes, she had to look twice to be certain, were the deep blue-gray of storm clouds. But it was his face that held her attention, weathered by sun and wind, with lines that spoke of squinting across vast distances, but gentle in a way that made her think of her father before drink had stolen his kindness. "I'm looking for work, sir," Clara said, lifting her chin with what dignity she could manage. "I can cook and clean, do washing and mending. I don't eat much, and I'm not afraid of hard work." The man, she could see now that he wore the clothes of someone in authority, better quality than the other ranch hands, stepped closer, and Clara fought the urge to retreat. His gaze took in her appearance without judgment, lingering only briefly on the fading bruises before settling on the basket in her arms. "I'm Michael Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying the trace of an accent she couldn't place. "This is my ranch. And you are?" "Clara Whitmore." The name felt strange on her tongue. She had been so many things to so many people in recent weeks. Desperate woman, burden, problem to be solved, that her own name seemed like something borrowed from another life. "What you got there, Miss Whitmore?" Michael nodded toward the basket, where soft squeaking sounds had begun again as the baby rabbits stirred. Clara hesitated, then carefully pulled back the blue cloth to reveal the 7 tiny creatures nestled inside. They were beautiful in the way that all baby animals are beautiful, soft and helpless and perfect. The golden one she had privately named Hope raised its head and sniffed the air with a tiny pink nose. Michael's expression softened immediately. "Where'd you find them?" "Their mother was dead beside the trail 2 days back," Clara said. "I couldn't just leave them." "Most people would have," Michael observed. "Rabbits are plentiful enough in these mountains. Most people aren't." Clara stopped herself before she could finish the thought. "Most people aren't as desperate for something to love as I am," she had been about to say. Instead, she looked down at the babies and said simply, "They needed help." Michael was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those storm-gray eyes. Clara felt as though he could see straight through to her soul, to all the secrets and shame and fear she carried. She waited for the questions that always came. Where was she from? Where was her husband? Why was she traveling alone? What had brought her to such straits? Instead, he surprised her. "You know anything about raising orphaned animals?" "Some," Clara admitted. "My grandmother had a way with creatures. She taught me about feeding schedules and keeping them warm. These ones are old enough for goat's milk mixed with a bit of cream." "We got goats," Michael said, "and we got cream from our dairy cows." He paused, seeming to weigh something in his mind. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore, you carry anything else with you? Anything that matters?" Clara's hand went instinctively to the locket at her throat, and she saw Michael's eyes follow the movement. The gold caught the morning light, heavy and substantial against her worn dress. "Just this," she said softly. Michael nodded slowly. "Pretty piece. Looks like it might have a story." The words hung in the air between them, neither question nor demand, but something more complex. Clara felt her heart racing as she realized that somehow, without meaning to, she had reached the moment that would determine everything that came next. "It does," she whispered. "You willing to share that story?" Clara's fingers tightened on the locket, feeling the familiar weight of it, the way the gold had warmed from resting against her skin for so many miles. Inside were the only 2 things left that connected her to who she used to be, before everything went wrong. She hadn't looked at them since the night she ran, couldn't bear to, because looking meant remembering, and remembering meant acknowledging how far she had fallen. I can't," she said, her voice barely audible. "Not yet." Michael studied her face for what felt like an eternity. Around them, the ranch continued its morning routine, but Clara felt as though the world had narrowed to just the 2 of them, and the weight of unspoken truths. Finally, he spoke. "Here's what I'm going to offer, Miss Whitmore. You can stay here at Silverbrook, help with the cooking and cleaning like you asked. Those rabbits of yours can have a place in the barn, and I'll make sure you get what you need to raise them proper." Clara's heart leaped, but she sensed there was more coming. "But," Michael continued, There's a condition. When you're ready, when you decide you trust this place and the people in it enough, you open that locket and share what's inside. Not with everyone, just with me. Until then, you got a place here, and no one will press you for more than you're willing to give." Clara stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You'd let me stay? Just like that? Without knowing anything about me?" "I know enough," Michael said simply. "I know you saved 7 baby rabbits when you could barely save yourself. I know you've been hurt, but you're still standing. I know you're scared, but brave enough to ask for help when you need it. That's more than enough to start with." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tears pricked Clara's eyes, the first she had allowed herself since leaving Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. "And if I never feel ready to open it?" Michael's smile was gentle, transforming his weathered face. "Then I reckon what's inside is your business, and always will be. But I got a feeling that when you're ready, this place will feel safe enough for sharing secrets." Clara looked down at the baby rabbits, then out across the ranch that might become her sanctuary. The morning sun had finally burned away the mist, revealing rolling pastures and distant mountains painted purple against the sky. It was beautiful in the way that wild places are beautiful, untamed but welcoming, harsh but honest. "All right," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "All right, Mr. Hartwell, I accept your offer." "Michael," he corrected gently. "We don't stand on ceremony much around here." "Michael," Clara repeated, and the name felt good on her tongue, solid and dependable like the man himself. Michael called to one of the cowboys working near the corral. "Tommy! Come give me a hand here." A young man with sandy hair and a ready smile jogged over, wiping his hands on his leather chaps. He was probably 19 or 20, with the kind of open face that suggested he had never met a stranger he didn't like. "Tommy Rodriguez," Michael said by way of introduction. "Best hand with animals on the ranch. Tommy, this is Miss Clara Whitmore. She's going to be helping us out for a while, and she's got some special charges that need tending." Tommy peered into the basket and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, miss. Baby rabbits? Where'd you find these little fellows?" Clara found herself explaining again about finding the orphaned litter, and Tommy listened with the kind of attention that suggested he genuinely cared about the fate of small, helpless creatures. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "We got a good setup in the barn for nursing animals," he said. "Built some pens last spring when we had a bunch of orphaned calves. Nice and warm, protected from the wind. I can show you how to mix the milk formula we use. Works for most any baby animal." "That would be wonderful," Clara said, and meant it. The relief of finding people who understood about caring for helpless things was almost overwhelming. Michael gestured toward the main house. "Let's get you settled first. Mrs. Rodriguez, that's Tommy's mother, Elena. She handles most of the cooking and household management. She'll want to meet you." They walked across the ranch yard, Clara trying to take in everything at once. The buildings were well maintained, painted white with green trim that spoke of prosperity without flash. Flowers grew in neat beds beside the main house, roses and lavender, and something with bright yellow blooms that she didn't recognize. Everything spoke of care, of people who took pride in their surroundings and had the time and resources to tend to beauty as well as necessity. The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Rocking chairs sat in groups, and Clara could imagine evenings spent watching the sunset over the mountains while the day's work was done. It was the kind of home she had dreamed of having someday, back when dreams seemed possible. Michael led her up the front steps and through a door into a hallway that smelled of beeswax and coffee, and something wonderful baking in the kitchen. The floors were polished wood, and the walls were painted a warm cream color that made the morning light seem to glow. It was simple but elegant, the home of people who had money enough for comfort but preferred understated beauty to ostentation. "Elena," Michael called out. "We've got a visitor." A woman appeared from what Clara assumed was the kitchen. wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 50, with graying dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind brown eyes that seemed to take in Clara's entire situation in a single glance. She was shorter than Clara, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. "This is Clara Whitmore," Michael said. "She's going to be staying with us for a while, helping out with cooking and household work." Elena Rodriguez studied Clara with the frank assessment of one woman sizing up another. Clara tried not to fidget under the scrutiny, knowing that this woman's opinion would likely determine how comfortable her stay at Silverbrook would be. "You look like you haven't had a decent meal in a week," Elena said finally, her voice carrying a slight accent that warmed her words. "And you're favoring that left leg." "What happened?" "Elena," Michael said with gentle warning. "It's all right," Clara said quickly. "I had a fall on the mountain trail. Nothing serious. Just sore." Elena's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded. "Well, first thing is to get some food into you. You're nothing but skin and bones. Come on into the kitchen, and we'll see what we can do about that." The kitchen was the heart of the house, Clara could see immediately. It was large and airy, with windows that looked out over the vegetable garden and pastures beyond. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, and copper pots hung from hooks overhead. The long wooden table in the center was scarred from years of use but polished to a warm glow. Fresh bread sat cooling on the counter, and the smell made Clara's mouth water despite her nervousness. "Sit," Elena commanded, pointing to a chair at the table. "Coffee first, then breakfast. Michael, you go see about those animals she's carrying. Tommy can show her the barn setup later." Michael accepted the dismissal with good humor, but before he left, he turned back to Clara. "Remember what I said about the locket," he said quietly. "No pressure, but when you're ready, I'll be here to listen." After he left, Elena poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and set it in front of Clara, along with a small pitcher of cream and a bowl of sugar. The coffee was strong and hot, and Clara wrapped her hands around the mug gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "So," Elena said, settling into the chair across from her with her own cup of coffee, "where are you from, and what brought you to our mountain?" Clara sipped her coffee, buying time to decide how much truth to share. "I was living in Millbrook, about 50 miles east of here. Circumstances changed, and I needed to find work elsewhere." "Circumstances," Elena repeated, her tone neutral but knowing. "That's a word that covers a lot of ground." "Yes," Clara said simply. "It does." Elena studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Fair enough. We all got circumstances we'd rather not discuss. Long as you're honest about your work and don't bring trouble to this ranch, your past is your own business." "Thank you," Clara said, relief evident in her voice. Elena got up and began bustling around the kitchen, assembling what appeared to be enough breakfast for several people. "Michael's a good man," she said as she worked, cracking eggs into a large cast-iron skillet. "Best employer I've ever had, and I've had a few. Fair, decent, doesn't ask more of people than they can give. But he's got a way of seeing through to the heart of things. If he offered you a place here, it's because he saw something worth keeping." Clara watched Elena work, noting the easy efficiency of someone who had been cooking for large groups for years. "How long have you worked here?" 15 years this fall," Elena said, flipping the eggs with practiced ease. "Came here when my husband died, bringing Tommy with me. He was just a little boy then, scared and grieving. Michael gave us both a home and a purpose. Tommy grew up on this ranch, learned everything he knows about cattle and horses from Michael and the other hands." "It must be a good place to raise a child," Clara said, thinking of the young man's easy smile and obvious contentment. "The best," Elena agreed. "Plenty of room to run and explore, good men to learn from, honest work that teaches you the value of things. Tommy's 21 now, and he could go anywhere, work any ranch he wanted. But he stays, because this is home." Elena set a plate in front of Clara that made her eyes widen. Eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, thick slices of fresh bread with butter and jam. It was more food than she had seen in one place in weeks, and her stomach growled audibly. "Eat," Elena commanded. "All of it. You're going to waste away to nothing if you don't get some meat on your bones." Clara ate slowly at first, then, with increasing hunger, as her body remembered what it felt like to have enough food. The eggs were perfect, the bacon crispy, the bread still warm from the oven. It was the kind of breakfast she remembered from childhood, when her grandmother would cook for the farmhands, and the kitchen would be full of laughter and the satisfaction of feeding hungry people well. "This is wonderful," Clara said between bites. "I haven't had a meal like this in a very long time." "Cooking's not work when you're feeding people who appreciate it," Elena said, refilling Clara's coffee cup. "Tell me about these baby animals Michael mentioned." Clara explained about finding the rabbits, and Elena listened with the same interested attention that Tommy had shown. When Clara finished, Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Rabbits can be good eating when they're grown," she said practically. "But they also make decent pets if you're inclined that way. We had a family of them in the vegetable garden a few years back, and they were entertaining little creatures, always getting into mischief." "I hope they'll be useful somehow," Clara said. "I don't want to be a burden." Elena's expression softened. "Child, you've been carrying baby animals for days while you walked through mountain country with an injured leg. You're not the kind of person who's a burden to anyone. You're the kind who takes care of things that need taking care of, even when you can barely take care of yourself." Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers who seemed determined to help her without asking for explanations she wasn't ready to give. After breakfast, Elena showed Clara through the main house, explaining the household routines and what would be expected of her. The house had 6 bedrooms upstairs, though only Michael used one regularly. The others were kept ready for visitors or ranch hands who might need indoor lodging during bad weather. "Michael's got family back east," Elena explained as they toured the upper floor. "His sister visits sometimes, brings her children. And we get buyers and business associates who stay over rather than making the trip back to town in a single day." Clara nodded, taking mental notes about cleaning schedules and which rooms needed daily attention versus weekly care. The work would be similar to what she had done at her grandmother's boarding house, but in a much more pleasant environment. "There's a small room off the kitchen that's yours if you want it," Elena continued, leading Clara back downstairs. "It's where the previous housekeeper slept before she got married and moved to town. Or, if you prefer more privacy, there's a cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house that's been empty since the last hand who used it took a job down in Colorado." Clara considered the options. The room off the kitchen would be warmer and more convenient, but the cabin would offer privacy and space to think without feeling like she was constantly under observation. "The cabin, I think," she said finally. "If that's all right." "Of course. Michael figured you might prefer your own space. We'll get you some supplies and make sure it's comfortable." They walked out through the kitchen garden to see the cabin Elena had mentioned. It was small but well built, with a stone chimney and windows that faced east toward the mountains. Inside, Clara found a main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a kitchen area with a wood-burning stove. The furniture was simple but sturdy. A table and chairs, a comfortable-looking bed with a colorful quilt, shelves for books and personal belongings. "It's perfect," Clara said, meaning it. The cabin felt safe and private, a place where she could begin to heal without having to constantly worry about what others might think or ask. "We'll get it cleaned up and stocked with whatever you need," Elena promised. "For tonight, though, you might want to stay in the main house. Give us time to air things out and make sure the chimney draws properly." They walked back toward the main house, where Clara could see Michael and Tommy near the barn, apparently preparing the animal pens Elena had mentioned. The sight of people taking her problems seriously, working to help creatures she had rescued, made her throat tight with emotion. "Elena," she said suddenly, "why are you all being so kind to me? You don't know anything about me, about what I might have done or why I'm really here." Elena stopped walking and turned to face Clara directly. "I know you risked your own safety to save baby animals that most people would have left to die. I know you're hurt and scared, but trying to be brave about it. I know you accepted help when you needed it, instead of being too proud to ask. That's enough for me to know about your character. But what if you're running from something terrible? What if you did something you're ashamed of? What if you're not who you seem to be? Elena's voice was gentle but firm. Child, we all got things we're running from or things we're ashamed of. What matters is who you choose to be going forward, not who you might have been forced to be in the past. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had been wound tight for weeks. I want to be better than I was, she said quietly. I want to be someone worth saving. You already are, Elena said simply. You just need time to remember it. They found Michael and Tommy in the barn, where they had set up a small pen, lined with fresh straw and equipped with shallow dishes for food and water. The setup was more elaborate than Clara had expected, with a heat lamp positioned to keep the area warm and windscreens to prevent drafts. This is wonderful, Clara said, kneeling beside the pen and carefully transferring the baby rabbits from their traveling basket to their new home. The little creatures immediately began exploring their expanded space, sniffing curiously at the fresh straw and each other. Tommy knows more about raising orphaned animals than anyone else in 3 counties, Michael said, pride evident in his voice. He saved everything from calves to baby birds. Tommy blushed at the praise but gestured toward a shelf where several bottles and containers were arranged. I mixed up some formula, like we use for calves, but adjusted for smaller animals. You'll want to feed them every 3 hours or so, just a little bit at a time. Too much and they'll get sick, too little and they won't thrive. Clara listened carefully as Tommy explained the feeding schedule and showed her how to use the small bottles he had prepared. The work would be demanding, especially with 7 babies to care for, but she found herself looking forward to the responsibility. These tiny creatures needed her, and she needed to be needed. There's one more thing, Michael said as they finished setting up the pen. These little ones are going to need names if they're going to be part of the Silverbrook family. Clara looked down at the 7 baby rabbits, each one unique in coloring and temperament. The golden one she had already privately named Hope in her heart. There was a brown one with white patches that reminded her of autumn leaves, and a gray one that seemed bolder than the others, always the first to investigate something new. Hope, she said, pointing to the golden rabbit. That one's Hope. Good name, Michael agreed. What about the others? Clara studied them thoughtfully. The brown and white one could be Autumn. The gray one, Courage, maybe. The solid brown one looks like Hazel. This little black one with the white spots could be Star. The white one with gray ears, Cloud. And this smallest one. She pointed to a pale brown rabbit that seemed more delicate than the others. Faith. Hope, Autumn, Courage, Hazel, Star, Cloud, and Faith. Tommy repeated, grinning. I like them. They sound like the names of rabbits who are going to grow up to be something special. As they stood watching the baby rabbits explore their new home, Clara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in months. These people had taken her in without question, provided for her needs and the needs of her small charges, and asked for nothing in return except an eventual explanation she might never be ready to give. Her hand went to the locket at her throat, feeling its familiar weight. Inside were 2 small photographs, the only images she had left of the people who had mattered most in her former life. She hadn't looked at them since the night she ran from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, couldn't bear to see the faces of those she had failed to protect. But standing here in the barn, surrounded by new friends, and watching over 7 tiny creatures who depended on her, Clara felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become courage enough to face the past. Thank you, she said, her voice catching slightly. All of you. For everything. Michael's hand settled gently on her shoulder, a gesture of reassurance and welcome. This is what neighbors do for each other out here, he said simply. What family does. Family. The word echoed in Clara's mind as they walked back toward the main house for lunch. She had lost her family, lost everything that had anchored her to the world, but perhaps she was being offered a chance to build something new. The locket at her throat felt less like a burden and more like a bridge between who she had been and who she might become. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity as Clara learned the rhythms of Silverbrook Ranch. Elena showed her the laundry routine, the cleaning schedules, the way meals were planned and prepared for the household and ranch hands. There were 12 men employed on the ranch year-round, Elena explained, with additional hands hired during roundup and branding seasons. We feed them well, Elena said as they planned the evening meal. Hard work requires good food, and satisfied men work better than hungry ones. Clara found herself falling easily into the routine, her hands remembering skills she had learned years ago at her grandmother's boarding house. She could handle large-scale cooking and cleaning, could manage household inventories and plan menus for groups. The work felt good, purposeful, a way to earn her place in this new community. As evening approached, she made her first trip back to the barn to feed the baby rabbits. Tommy had left detailed instructions, and Clara followed them carefully, warming the formula to the right temperature and using the small bottles to feed each rabbit in turn. They were eager eaters, their tiny paws gripping the bottles as they nursed. "You're all going to be fine," she murmured as she worked. "We're all going to be fine." The golden rabbit, Hope, seemed to watch her with unusual intelligence as it fed, and Clara found herself talking to the small creature as though it could understand. "I know you're scared," she said softly. "I'm scared too. But we found a safe place, and there are good people here who want to help us. We just have to be brave enough to let them." As if in response, Hope finished nursing and curled up against Clara's palm, the tiny body warm and trusting. Clara felt tears threaten again, overwhelmed by the simple trust of a creature that had every reason to fear the world, but had chosen instead to believe in kindness. By the time she finished with all 7 rabbits, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Clara stood in the barn doorway, watching the light fade and listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch, settling in for the night. Cattle lowed in the distance, horses nickered softly in their stalls, and somewhere a night bird called its lonely song. This was peace, Clara realized. This was what safety felt like. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually have found a place where she could heal, where she could build something new from the ruins of her old life. Her hand went to the locket one more time, and she whispered a promise to the photographs hidden inside. "Someday," she said, "when I'm strong enough, when I'm worthy enough, I'll look at you again. I'll remember properly, and I'll figure out how to make things right." The evening air was cool against her face as she walked back toward the main house, where warm light glowed in the windows and the smell of Elena's cooking promised another good meal shared with people who cared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the kindness she had been shown. But tonight, she was safe, she was fed, she had a purpose, and 7 tiny creatures depended on her for their survival. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The first week at Silverbrook Ranch passed like a dream Clara was afraid she might wake from. Each morning brought the ritual of feeding the baby rabbits, now thriving in their barn pen under Tommy's expert guidance. Hope had grown noticeably, her golden fur taking on a lustrous sheen that caught the morning light. The others followed suit, each developing distinct personalities that made Clara smile despite the weight of secrets she carried. Michael proved to be a different kind of man than any Clara had known. He worked alongside his hands, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself, yet commanded respect through quiet authority rather than bluster. She watched him from the kitchen window as she helped Elena prepare breakfast, noting how he moved among the men with easy confidence, checking on tasks without hovering, offering guidance without condescension. "He's a natural leader," Elena commented one morning, following Clara's gaze. "Born to it, you might say. His father was the same way, from what I hear." "He seems young to own such a large operation," Clara observed, immediately regretting the comment. She was supposed to be grateful for shelter, not analyzing her benefactor. Elena laughed, not unkindly. "Michael's 32, though I suppose all the responsibility makes him seem older sometimes. He inherited the ranch when he was 25, after his parents died in a carriage accident. Been running it ever since, and doing a fine job of it." Clara absorbed this information, adding it to the growing picture she had of the man who had taken her in. An orphan himself, thrust into responsibility at a young age, yet he had chosen kindness over hardness, generosity over suspicion. The locket at her throat seemed to grow heavier as she considered the contrast between his openness and her own locked-away secrets. The routine of ranch life began to feel natural. Clara rose before dawn to help Elena prepare breakfast for the hands, then spent the morning hours cleaning and organizing the main house. The work was familiar and satisfying, each completed task a small proof of her worth. After lunch, she would visit the rabbits, checking their health and progress under Tommy's watchful guidance. "They're doing better than I expected," Tommy said one afternoon as they watched the 7 babies hop around their expanded pen. Clara had convinced Michael to let them have more space as they grew, and now they had a large enclosure that allowed for proper exercise and exploration. "Courage is definitely the leader," Clara observed, watching the gray rabbit investigate a new wooden box Tommy had added for shelter. "The others follow wherever he goes." "Smart little fellow too," Tommy agreed. "Watch how he tests everything before the others try it." That's good survival instinct. Clara found herself growing attached to each rabbit's unique personality. Star, the black one with white spots, was the most playful, always ready for games. Cloud, pure white with gray ears, seemed the most gentle, often grooming the others. Faith, the smallest and most delicate, had become Clara's particular favorite. Perhaps because she recognized something of herself in the little creature's cautious nature. It was during the second week that Clara encountered her first real challenge at Silverbrook. A group of cattle buyers arrived from Denver, important men whose business could significantly impact the ranch's prosperity. Elena had been preparing for days, planning elaborate meals and ensuring every detail of their stay would reflect well on Michael's hospitality. "These men control access to the eastern markets," Elena explained as they prepared the guest bedrooms. "Michael's been cultivating relationships with them for years. Everything needs to be perfect." Clara threw herself into the preparations, determined to prove her worth. She polished silver that hadn't seen use in months, arranged flowers from Elena's garden in every guest room, and helped plan a welcoming dinner that would showcase the best of what Silverbrook could offer. The buyers arrived on a Thursday afternoon, a party of 5 men in expensive suits and traveling in a specially appointed wagon that spoke of wealth and influence. Clara watched from the kitchen window as Michael greeted them personally, his demeanor professional yet warm. She felt a flutter of nervousness, knowing that her performance over the next few days could determine whether she remained welcome at Silverbrook. The first dinner went smoothly. Clara and Elena worked in perfect synchronization, producing course after course of carefully prepared food. Roast beef with herb gravy, fresh trout from the mountain streams, vegetables from the ranch garden, and desserts that drew compliments from even the most refined palates. Clara served silently and efficiently, the way she had learned at her grandmother's boarding house, making herself useful while remaining invisible. It was on the second evening that everything changed. Clara was serving the final course, a delicate apple tart that Elena had spent hours perfecting, when one of the buyers, a florid man named Jameson with too much pomade in his hair, reached out and grabbed her wrist as she set down his dessert plate. "Well now," he said, his voice loud with wine and self-importance. "What have we here? Michael, you've been holding out on us. This is quite an improvement over that sour-faced housekeeper you had last time." Clara froze, every instinct screaming at her to pull away, but years of experience with difficult men had taught her that resistance often made things worse. She stood perfectly still, waiting for the moment to pass, praying that Michael would intervene. "Miss Whitmore is our head housekeeper," Michael said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made the other men at the table shift uncomfortably. "I'd appreciate it if you'd release her so she can continue her duties." Jameson's grip tightened instead of loosening, his thumb rubbing across the inside of Clara's wrist in a way that made her skin crawl. "Come now, Michael. Surely we can be more sociable than that. What's your first name, sweetheart?" "Clara." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Clara," Jameson repeated, drawing out the syllables. "Pretty name for a pretty girl. Tell me, Clara, what brings a lovely thing like you to work in such a remote location? Running from something, perhaps?" The question hit Clara like a physical blow. Her free hand went instinctively to the locket at her throat, and she saw Jameson's eyes follow the movement with predatory interest. "That's quite a piece of jewelry for a housekeeper," he continued, his grip on her wrist preventing her from stepping away. "Family heirloom. or a gift from someone special. Clara felt the familiar panic rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced during her last days with Mrs. Henderson, when the solutions offered had all required surrendering her dignity and self-respect. She looked desperately toward Michael, silently pleading for rescue. Michael rose from his chair with deliberate calm, but Clara could see the anger radiating from every line of his body. "Jameson," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "I'm going to ask you one more time to release my employee." "Employee?" Jameson laughed, though his eyes had gone calculating. "Is that what we're calling it? Come now, Michael, we're all men of the world here. No need to pretend this arrangement is purely professional." The implication hung in the air like poison, and Clara felt her face flame with humiliation. Around the table, the other buyers watched with the uncomfortable fascination of men witnessing a scene they knew had gone too far, but were too cowardly to intervene in. Michael moved around the table with predatory grace, and something in his expression finally made Jameson release Clara's wrist. She stumbled backward, cradling her bruised arm against her chest. "You will apologize to Miss Whitmore immediately," Michael said, positioning himself between Clara and the table. "And then you will retire to your room for the evening." Jameson's face darkened with anger and embarrassment. "Now see here, Hartwell. There's no need to get defensive about your domestic arrangements. I'm simply suggesting that a young woman in her position might be open to additional compensations for her services." The words were barely out of his mouth before Michael's fist connected with his jaw. Jameson went down hard, his chair toppling backward as he crashed to the floor. The other buyers scrambled away from the table, shouting in alarm. "Jesus Christ, Michael!" one of them yelled. "Have you gone completely mad?" Michael stood over Jameson's prone form, his chest rising and falling with controlled rage. "Miss Whitmore is under my protection," he said clearly, addressing the room. "Any man who insults her insults me personally. I trust that's understood by everyone present." Clara stood frozen by the sideboard, hardly able to believe what she had witnessed. No one had ever defended her honor so decisively, so publicly. The gesture was both thrilling and terrifying, because it meant Michael saw her as someone worth protecting, someone whose reputation mattered. Jameson struggled to his feet with help from his companions, blood trickling from his split lip. His eyes were wild with humiliation and fury. "You'll regret this, Hartwell," he spat. "No one in Denver will do business with a man who assaults his customers over a servant girl." "Then I'll find other markets," Michael replied calmly. "There are plenty of buyers who understand the difference between business and boorishness." The evening ended in chaos, with the buyers retiring early and Clara helping Elena clean up the disrupted dinner service in tense silence. When the last dish was washed and put away, Elena sent Clara to her cabin with instructions to rest and not worry about the morning routine. Clara sat on her small porch in the mountain darkness, her wrist still aching where Jameson had gripped it. The locket felt like a burning weight against her chest, and she found herself thinking about the assumptions men made about women traveling alone, women without obvious protection or status. She had hoped that finding honest work in a respectable household would shield her from such speculation, but apparently her past would always cast shadows on her present. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps approaching along the path. Michael emerged from the darkness, his white shirt visible in the starlight. He moved carefully, perhaps sensing her fragile state. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the other chair on the small porch. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Michael settled into the chair with a weary sigh, and they sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and the distant call of coyotes in the mountains. "I owe you an apology," Michael said finally. Clara looked at him in surprise. "You owe me an apology? You defended me. You risked an important business relationship to protect my honor." "I should have prevented the situation entirely," Michael replied, his voice heavy with self-reproach. "I knew Jameson's reputation, knew he had wandering hands and a loose tongue. I should have made other arrangements for serving dinner, should have anticipated that he might see you as fair game." Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "You couldn't have known he would behave so badly, and you stopped it before." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what might have happened if Michael hadn't intervened. Men like Jameson see a young woman working as a domestic and make certain assumptions, Michael said quietly, especially a woman traveling alone, without obvious family connections. I should have considered how vulnerable that makes you. They sat in contemplative silence again, and Clara found herself studying Michael's profile in the dim light. His jaw was still set with residual anger, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was genuinely upset by what had happened, not just angry about the disruption to his business dealings, but concerned about her welfare. "What will happen with the cattle contracts?" she asked eventually. Michael shrugged. "Jameson will try to poison other buyers against me, at least in the short term, but his reputation for poor behavior is well known. Most serious businessmen will take his complaints with a grain of salt, especially when they hear why I hit him." "I'm sorry," Clara said, the words barely audible. "I'm sorry that helping me has cost you business opportunities." Michael turned to lock at her directly, and even in the dim light she could see the intensity in his storm-gray eyes. "Clara, listen to me carefully. No amount of money is worth allowing a woman under my protection to be treated with disrespect. Not $1, not one contract, not one business relationship. Do you understand?" The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Clara's throat tight with emotion. "I understand," she whispered. "Good." Michael leaned back in his chair, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Now, do you want to tell me what really happened that made you leave Millbrook?" The question hung in the air between them, gentle, but persistent. Clara's hand went instinctively to the locket, feeling its familiar weight. For a moment, she considered opening it right there, sharing the truth about who she was and what she was running from. But the fear was still too strong, the shame too fresh. "I can't," she said quietly. "Not yet." Michael nodded, accepting her refusal without argument. "When you're ready," he said simply. "I'll be here to listen." The next morning brought fresh challenges. Word of the confrontation had spread among the ranch hands, and Clara could feel their curious glances as she went about her morning routine. Some seemed protective, viewing her as someone who needed looking after. Others appeared speculative, wondering what had made her worth defending so publicly. Elena, predictably, was furious about the entire situation. "That pig Jameson," she muttered as they prepared breakfast. "I should have put something in his food to give him the runs for a week." "Elena," Clara protested, though she couldn't help smiling at the older woman's fierce loyalty. "Don't Elena me," she replied, attacking a batch of biscuit dough with unusual vigor. Men like that think they can take liberties with any woman they consider beneath their station. It's about time someone taught him differently. The buyers departed that morning in stiff formality, their farewells to Michael cordial but cool. Clara watched from the kitchen window as their wagon rolled away, wondering if she had destroyed Michael's carefully cultivated business relationship simply by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was Tommy who finally addressed the elephant in the room. He found Clara that afternoon as she was feeding the rabbits, now grown large enough to eat solid food supplemented with milk. "Miss Clara," he said, settling onto a hay bale nearby, "I wanted you to know that what happened last night, it doesn't change anything about how we see you here." Clara looked up from where she was filling water dishes, touched by his obvious sincerity. "Thank you, Tommy. I was worried that everyone would think..." "Would think what? That you somehow asked for that treatment?" Tommy's voice carried an edge of anger that reminded Clara he was Elena's son, with all the protective instincts that implied. Anyone who knows you for 5 minutes can see that you're a decent woman trying to make an honest living. What Jameson implied, that was about his own character, not yours. Clara felt tears threaten and busied herself with checking on Faith, who had grown stronger but remained the most delicate of the 7 rabbits. "I don't want to cause problems for Michael or the ranch," she said quietly. "The only problem you've caused is making the rest of us realize how much better this place is with you in it," Tommy replied firmly. "Michael did what any decent man would do, and if those buyers can't understand that, then they're not the kind of people we want to do business with anyway." That evening, Clara found herself alone with Michael again, this time in the main house as they reviewed household accounts. It was a task Elena had gradually shifted to Clara as her organizational skills became apparent, and Michael had readily agreed to the arrangement. "The supply orders look good," Michael said, scanning the ledger Clara had prepared. "You've found some economies I wouldn't have thought of." "Elena taught me to look for bulk purchasing opportunities," Clara replied. "And I noticed we were paying premium prices for some items we could get more reasonably from different suppliers." Michael nodded approvingly. "You have a head for business. That's a valuable skill." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the scratching of pens and rustling of papers, the only sounds in the warm lamplight of Michael's study. Clara found herself stealing glances at him as he worked, noting the concentration on his weathered face, the way he absently pushed a lock of dark hair back from his forehead when he was thinking. "Michael," she said suddenly, then paused, uncertain how to voice the question that had been troubling her. He looked up expectantly, pen poised over a column of figures. "Why did you really take me in?" she asked. "I mean, beyond the kindness of helping someone in need. You could have given me a meal and directions to the nearest town. Instead, you offered me a job, a place to live, asked for nothing in return except, someday, an explanation I might never be ready to give." Michael set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, considering her question seriously. "Do you want the practical answer or the honest one?" "Both," Clara said without hesitation. "Practically speaking, we needed help with the household management. Elena's getting older, though she'd never admit it, and the ranch has grown enough that the domestic workload was becoming too much for one person. You arrived with obvious skills and a willingness to work hard." Clara nodded, accepting this reasoning. "And the honest answer?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face in the lamplight. "Because you reminded me of myself when I was younger, and facing impossible circumstances alone. Because you were protecting something vulnerable despite your own vulnerability. Because—" He trailed off, seeming to wrestle with words he wasn't sure he should speak. "Because," Clara prompted gently, "because from the moment I saw you walking down that mountain path, carrying baby animals you could have abandoned to save yourself. I knew you were someone worth saving," he said finally. "And because this ranch has felt more like a home since you arrived than it has in years." The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Clara felt her heart racing as she processed what he had revealed. This wasn't just kindness to a stranger anymore. This was something deeper, more personal, more frightening. Because it mattered so much. "Michael," she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly. "I don't want to add pressure to whatever you're already carrying. I just wanted you to know that your presence here isn't charity. It's valued. You're valued." Clara looked down at the locket resting against her dress, feeling its weight differently now. Inside were photographs of two people who had loved her unconditionally, who had believed she was worth protecting even when it cost them everything. Now here was another person offering her the same kind of acceptance, and she was still too afraid to trust it completely. "I want to be worthy of that value," she said quietly. "You already are," Michael replied, echoing Elena's words from her first day. "You just need time to believe it." The weeks that followed brought a gradual shift in the dynamics of Silverbrook Ranch. The cattle buyer's departure seemed to have cleared the air, and Clara found herself settling more deeply into the rhythm of ranch life. The baby rabbits continued to thrive, now large enough to be moved to an outdoor pen where they could graze and explore under the mountain sun. Clara's relationship with Michael evolved too, growing deeper and more complex with each passing day. They worked together easily, whether planning household improvements or discussing ranch business. Their evening conversations became longer and more personal, though always stopping short of the revelations Clara wasn't ready to make. She began to notice things about him that went beyond his role as ranch owner and protector. The way he always checked on the horses before retiring for the night. His habit of leaving small gifts of wildflowers or interesting stones on her porch. His genuine interest in her opinions about everything from book recommendations to menu planning. "He's courting you," Elena observed one morning as they watched Michael demonstrate a new technique for training horses to a group of admiring ranch hands. In his own careful way. Clara blushed, not bothering to deny the obvious. "He's being kind to someone who needed help." "Child, I've known Michael Hartwell for 15 years, Elena said with amused exasperation. "I've seen him be kind to plenty of people who needed help. This is different. This is a man who's found something precious and is willing to wait as long as necessary to claim it properly. That afternoon, Clara found herself in the rabbit pen, watching Hope and her 6 companions explore their expanded territory. The golden rabbit had grown into a beautiful adult, her coat lustrous and her movements graceful. She seemed to recognize Clara's voice and would come when called, a trait that never failed to amuse the ranch hands. "She knows you're the one who saved her," Tommy observed, joining Clara at the pen's fence. "Animals remember kindness, especially when they're young and vulnerable." Clara watched Hope investigate a new wooden shelter Tommy had built, her small pink nose twitching with curiosity. "I sometimes think she saved me more than I saved her, giving me a purpose when I didn't have anything else." "Maybe you saved each other," Tommy suggested. "Sometimes that's how it works." That evening brought an unexpected test of Clara's growing sense of security. She was returning from her final check on the rabbits when she heard voices from the front porch of the main house. Visitors arriving after dark, which was unusual enough to make her cautious. She approached carefully, staying in the shadows until she could assess the situation. 3 men sat on horseback in the circle of lamplight from the porch, their faces hard and travel-worn. Michael stood on the steps with several ranch hands behind him, his posture alert but not immediately threatening. "We're looking for a woman," one of the riders was saying, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Young, auburn hair, traveling alone. Goes by the name Clara Whitmore." Clara's blood turned to ice. She pressed herself against the side of the barn, heart hammering so loudly she was sure everyone in the yard could hear it. They had found her. Somehow, after all these weeks, they had tracked her to Silverbrook. "Can't say I know anyone by that description," Michael replied calmly. "What's your business with her?" "She's wanted for questioning in connection with a theft in Millbrook," the lead rider said. "Valuable property went missing from the boarding house where she was staying. The owner filed a complaint with the territorial marshal." Clara bit back a gasp of outrage. Mrs. Henderson was claiming she had stolen something. After everything that woman had tried to force her to do, now she was manufacturing criminal charges to cover her own reputation? "That's a serious accusation," Michael said, his voice giving nothing away. "You have warrants, I assume?" The riders exchanged glances, and Clara caught the slight hesitation that suggested their authority might not be as official as they wanted it to appear. "We're working with local law enforcement," the lead man said evasively. "If you're harboring a thief, you could be charged as an accessory." "If I were harboring someone, which I'm not," Michael replied evenly, "I'd want to see proper documentation before turning anyone over to strangers who ride onto my property after dark making threats." Clara could see the tension building in the confrontation, and knew she had to act before it escalated into violence. These men were clearly willing to use force to get what they wanted, and she couldn't allow Michael and his people to be hurt because of her problems. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the group, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said clearly. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" The lead rider smiled with predatory satisfaction. "There she is. Miss Whitmore, you're under arrest for theft of valuable jewelry from the Henderson boarding house in Millbrook." "What jewelry?" Clara demanded, even as her hand moved instinctively to the locket at her throat. "A gold locket and chain, valued at over $50, the man replied. "Mrs. Henderson reported it missing the day after you disappeared. Funny coincidence, that." Clara felt the world tilt around her. The locket had been hers since childhood, a gift from her grandmother, containing the only photographs she had of her parents. Mrs. Henderson knew perfectly well it didn't belong to her, but apparently she was willing to commit perjury to force Clara back into her power. "This locket belonged to my grandmother," Clara said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Mrs. Henderson has no claim to it." "That's for a judge to decide," the rider said, dismounting and moving toward her. "You're coming with us." "I don't think so," Michael said quietly, stepping between Clara and the approaching man. "Like I said, I'd need to see proper warrants before allowing anyone to be removed from my property." The confrontation that followed happened quickly. The lead rider reached for his gun, apparently deciding that force would be more effective than legal niceties. Michael was faster, his own weapon appearing in his hand with practiced ease. Around the yard, ranch hands materialized from the shadows, rifles and pistols trained on the unwelcome visitors. "Gentlemen," Michael said conversationally, "I believe you're outnumbered and outgunned. I suggest you remount your horses and continue your search elsewhere." For a tense moment, Clara thought the riders might choose violence anyway. Then the lead man slowly raised his hands, signaling his companions to stand down. "This isn't over, Hartwell," he snarled. "We know she's here now. We'll be back with proper authority." "When you do," Michael replied calmly, "make sure it's legitimate authority. I have friends in the territorial government who take a dim view of fraudulent law enforcement." The riders departed with threats and promises of return, leaving Clara shaking with reaction in the sudden quiet of the ranch yard. Michael holstered his weapon and turned to her, his expression concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, though she was far from all right. The confrontation had shattered her growing sense of safety, reminding her that the past was never really past, that there would always be people willing to use her vulnerabilities against her. "We need to talk," Michael said quietly. "All of us. In the house." The impromptu council of war included Michael, Elena, Tommy, and Mac Henderson, the ranch foreman who had emerged as one of Michael's most trusted advisors. They gathered in the main house parlor, the atmosphere tense with the aftermath of confrontation. "Those weren't real law officers," Mac said bluntly. "I've seen enough badge-wearing men to know the difference. Those were hired muscle, probably working for whoever wants Miss Clara returned to wherever she came from." "Mrs. Henderson," Clara said quietly, "the woman who owned the boarding house where I was staying after my husband died. She wanted me to earn my keep in ways that weren't respectable. When I refused and tried to leave, she claimed I owed her money for room and board. Now apparently she's decided to add theft to the charges." Elena made a sound of disgust. "Procurus," she spat, "trying to force a grieving widow into prostitution, then manufacturing criminal charges when she escapes. It's an old, ugly story." Michael's jaw was tight with controlled anger. "How did they track you here?" Clara shook her head helplessly. "I don't know. I was careful to avoid main roads, didn't use my real name in any towns I passed through. But somehow—" "Someone must have recognized you," Tommy suggested. "Or maybe they've been checking every ranch and settlement in the territory." "Either way," Mac said grimly, "they'll be back. And next time they might bring real law officers, or at least people who can fake the credentials better." Michael was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant with thought. Finally, he looked directly at Clara. "I think it's time for the whole truth," he said gently. "If we're going to protect you properly, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Clara felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. She had grown to trust these people, had begun to believe she might have found a permanent sanctuary at Silverbrook, but the locket still felt like a burning weight against her skin, and the secrets inside seemed too terrible to share. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm not ready." Michael nodded, accepting her refusal, though she could see the frustration in his eyes. "Then we'll have to work with what we know. Mac, I want guards posted around the clock. Anyone approaches the property, I want to know about it immediately." "Already on it, boss," Mac replied. "The boys are pretty stirred up about strangers threatening Miss Clara. They won't get within a mile of the ranch house without us knowing." Elena leaned forward in her chair, her expression fierce with protective determination. "There might be another way," she said thoughtfully. "My brother-in-law works for the territorial government in the capital. He could make some inquiries, find out if there are legitimate charges filed against Clara, or if this is all fabrication." "That's a good idea," Michael agreed. "Can you contact him quickly?" "I'll send a telegram tomorrow," Elena promised. "Juan has connections throughout the law enforcement community. If these charges are false, he'll be able to prove it." Clara felt overwhelmed by the level of support these people were offering her. They were willing to risk their own safety, spend their own resources, call in personal favors, all to protect someone who hadn't even trusted them with the complete truth about her situation. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the word coming out more desperate than she intended. "Why are you all willing to do so much for me?" The question hung in the air, and Clara saw the adults exchange glances that suggested they had discussed this among themselves. It was Elena who finally answered. "Because you're family now," she said simply. "That's how it works out here. When someone becomes part of your community, part of your household, you protect them, no matter what." "But you don't know what I might have done," Clara protested. "What if the charges are true? What if I really am a thief?" Michael leaned forward, his storm gray eyes intense. "Are you?" he asked directly. Clara met his gaze steadily. "No, I never stole anything from Mrs. Henderson or anyone else. The locket was my grandmother's, given to me when I was 12 years old. It's the only thing of value I own, and it's mine by right." "Then that's all I need to know," Michael said firmly. "We'll fight this together, whatever it takes." Later that night, Clara sat in her cabin with the locket in her palm, studying its familiar surface by lamplight. The gold was worn smooth in places from years of handling, and the delicate engraving around the edges was barely visible now. Inside were 2 small photographs, the faces of people who had loved her unconditionally, who had died believing she would live up to their hopes for her. She thought about Michael's words earlier, about this being her family now, about being worthy of protection and care. The baby rabbits were settled for the night in their pen, safe and thriving under her care. The ranch house glowed with warm light, sheltering people who had risked their own security to defend her. Perhaps it was time to stop running from the past and start building a future. Perhaps it was time to trust that the love her parents had given her, preserved in the photographs inside the locket, was strong enough to bridge the gap between who she had been and who she was becoming. But not tonight. Tonight, she was still too afraid of what opening that locket might reveal, not just to others, but to herself. The grief and guilt and desperate love contained within those small photographs felt too powerful to release, too overwhelming to face. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the fragile security she had found at Silverbrook Ranch. But tonight, she was safe, she was valued, and she was surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with her despite not knowing all her secrets. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The locket grew warm in her palm as she held it, and Clara whispered a promise to the faces inside. "Soon," she said quietly. "When I'm strong enough, when I'm worthy enough, I'll look at you again. I'll remember properly, and I'll figure out how to make things right." Outside her cabin, the mountain night was full of sounds. Cattle settling, horses moving in their pastures, the distant call of night birds. But underneath it all was something new, something she was just beginning to recognize as the sound of home. Not just a place to hide, but a place to belong, a place worth fighting for. And fight she would, Clara decided, closing her fingers around the locket. Whatever Mrs. Henderson and her hired men had planned, whatever lies they were willing to tell or crimes they were willing to commit, Clara would not be driven away from the first real home she had found since her world collapsed. The people of Silverbrook Ranch had claimed her as family. Now it was time for her to prove herself worthy of that claim. Locket or no locket, secrets or no secrets. Some battles were worth fighting, and some families were worth any sacrifice required to protect them. The telegram arrived 3 days later, carried by a dust-covered rider who had traveled hard from the territorial capital. Elena tore it open with trembling fingers, her face grave as she read the contents aloud to the assembled household. No official charges filed against Clara Whitmore in territorial records. Henderson boarding house owner under investigation for operating illegal establishment. Warrant issued for false reporting. You're advised to protect the witness. Relief flooded through Clara like cool water, followed immediately by a different kind of fear. She was no longer running from the law, but Mrs. Henderson's desperation would make her more dangerous, not less. Michael folded the telegram carefully. "This changes things. Those men will be back, but now they're criminals, not law officers. We need to end this permanently." That evening, Clara found herself alone with Michael on the front porch, watching storm clouds gather over the distant peaks. The air was thick with approaching rain, and lightning flickered silently in the darkness. "I need to tell you something," she said suddenly, her hand moving to the locket. "About who I really am." Michael turned toward her, his expression patient and encouraging. "I'm listening." Clara's fingers found the catch on the locket, and for the first time in months, she opened it. Inside were 2 small photographs, a young woman with Clara's green eyes and auburn hair, and a tall man with gentle features and work-worn hands. "My parents," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They died when I was 16. A fire took our farm and everything we had." I went to live with my grandmother, who gave me this locket before she passed 2 years later. Michael studied the photographs with respectful attention. They look like good people. They were everything good in the world, Clara said, tears spilling down her cheeks, and I failed them. After grandmother died, I married Walter Whitmore because I was alone and scared. He seemed kind at first, but... She couldn't finish the sentence. He hurt you, Michael said quietly. Clara nodded. When he died in a mining accident, I thought I was free, but he'd left debts, and his creditors came for everything. Mrs. Henderson offered me shelter at her boarding house, but the price... She shuddered. When I refused her terms, she threw me out with nothing but this locket and the clothes on my back. And you found the baby rabbits, Michael said. They gave me a reason to keep going when I wanted to give up, Clara admitted. Just like this place, like all of you, gave me hope again. Michael reached over and took her hand gently. Clara, why didn't you trust us with this before? Because I was ashamed, she whispered. My parents raised me to be strong, to be worthy of their love. Instead, I made terrible choices, married the wrong man, lost everything they worked for. I felt like I'd dishonored their memory. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Do you think they'd want you to carry that shame forever? Clara looked down at the photographs again, seeing her father's patient smile, her mother's determined chin. No, she said softly. They'd want me to be happy. Then let them rest in peace and choose happiness, Michael said simply. Choose the future instead of the past. Before Clara could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful evening. But this time, it was Mac and Tommy returning from town with news that changed everything. Boss! Mac called out as he dismounted. You need to hear this. Mrs. Henderson's dead. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Dead? How? Territorial marshals raided her place yesterday, Tommy explained, his young face grim. She pulled a gun on them rather than face arrest. They didn't have a choice. What about the men she hired? Michael asked. Scattered like leaves in a windstorm, Mac replied. Without her money backing them, they've got no reason to keep hunting Miss Clara. The news should have brought relief, but Clara felt only emptiness. Mrs. Henderson had been an evil woman, but her death felt like the final severing of Clara's connection to her old life. It's over, she said wonderingly. It's really over. Michael stood and extended his hand to her. Clara Whitmore, you're free to go wherever you want, be whoever you want to be. What do you choose? Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then at the ranch house glowing with warm light, then at the barn where 7 rabbits slept safely in their pen. Finally, she looked at the locket in her palm, at the faces of parents who had loved her unconditionally. She closed the locket gently and took Michael's hand. I choose home, she said firmly. I choose family. I choose you. Michael's smile was radiant as he pulled her to her feet. Clara Whitmore, he said formally, will you marry me? Yes, she laughed through her tears. Yes, Michael Hartwell, I will. 6 months later, Clara stood in the same spot where she had first glimpsed Silverbrook Ranch, but everything had changed. She wore a simple white dress that Elena had sewn with loving care, and in her hands she carried a bouquet of wildflowers picked by Tommy that morning. The baby rabbits, now fully grown, grazed contentedly in their expanded pen. Hope, the golden one who had started it all, had recently given birth to a litter of her own, continuing the cycle of life and hope. As Clara walked toward the ranch house where Michael waited with the circuit preacher, she touched the locket at her throat one final time. Inside, her parents' faces smiled out at the world, their love finally freed from the prison of shame and fear she had built around it. She had found her way home at last, not to a place but to a family, not to safety but to love. And sometimes, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.